Today we are going to look at two stories that took place in the late 19th century. Both of these cases started out looking like tragic but simple crimes. But as the investigators began to peel back the layers of what actually happened, they discovered things that were so bizarre and so unsettling that they defy logical explanation. Our first story takes us to the historic city of Guanajuato, Mexico in the year 1890. Now, Guanajuato at this time was a place of massive contrasts. On one hand, it was a booming silver mining city, which meant there was an incredible amount of wealth flowing through the area. Beautiful, grand homes were being built, and the wealthy elite walked the clean, cobblestone streets of the upscale neighborhoods. But on the other hand, just a few streets away, you had incredibly dark, narrow, unlit passageways where crime was common, and the local police struggled to maintain order. A young man named Teodoro Felenio Mejia, who everyone called Tedo, lived right in the middle of this beautiful, wealthy world. But Tedo had not been born into wealth. He grew up in the dusty, poor outskirts of the city, watching the wealthy mining owners and dreaming of one day having that life for himself. Through sheer determination, hard work, and long hours of studying under dim candlelight, Tito worked his way up. He started out working 12-hour shifts in the deep, dangerous underground shafts of the silver mines, breathing in the thick dust and risking his life every single day. But he was smart, and he learned everything he could about geology, logistics, and engineering. Eventually, he became a highly respected and very successful mining engineer. Tito made brilliant investments, and before long he had amassed a small fortune. He was proud of his success, but he felt like his life was truly complete only after he met a young woman named Maria. Maria was from a modest but highly respected local family, and the moment Tito saw her at a local social gathering, he was completely smitten. She was intelligent, funny, deeply caring, and incredibly beautiful. They fell in love fast, and Tito was determined to give her the best life possible. As a wedding present, Tito bought Maria a massive, expensive mansion in one of the most exclusive, quiet, and safe neighborhoods in Guanajuato. The house was magnificent, with tall stone walls, a large private courtyard, high ceilings, and beautiful furniture. It was the perfect symbol of how far Tito had come from his humble beginnings. It was also in a perfect location because it was close to where Tito worked, and it was within walking distance of Maria's family, who she visited very often. The neighborhood was safe, clean, and filled with other upper-class professionals who all knew and respected each other. For Tito, life was absolutely perfect. But on one particular evening in 1890, Tito was not feeling like a successful, wealthy man. He was lying in his large bed inside their master bedroom feeling completely miserable. He had come down with a sudden severe fever. His body was aching, his skin was hot to the touch, and he was shivering under his thick blankets. As he rolled over and let out a long, agonizing sigh, he heard the heavy wooden door to his bedroom creak open. He looked up and saw Maria walking into the room. Maria had a gentle smile on her face, and in her hands, she carried a warm cup of herbal tea she had brewed specifically to help soothe his fever. She walked over to his bedside table, set the cup down, and then sat on the edge of the mattress next to him. Even though Tito felt physically terrible, the simple presence of his wife made him smile. He sat up slowly, feeling dizzy, and took a small sip of the warm tea. He looked at Maria, feeling incredibly grateful to have her in his life, but as he put the cup down, he noticed that Maria had a somewhat apologetic look on her face. She reached out, patted his hand, and explained that she had to leave the house. She was scheduled to have dinner with her family that evening, and if she did not leave right away, she was going to be late. When Maria said this, Tito immediately felt a knot form in his stomach. It was true that Maria visited her family often, and they lived just a short walk away. But usually, when she went to see them, Tito would walk her there. The reason was because to get to her family's house, Maria had to leave their safe, well-policed neighborhood and walk through a couple of dark, narrow streets that were known to be sketchy and dangerous, especially after dark. Tito was always terrified that she might get cornered by bandits, mugged, or worse. But tonight, Tito was simply too weak and too sick to get out of bed, let alone walk her through the dark streets. Tito told Maria that he was really worried about her walking alone tonight. He asked her if she could please stay home, or at least wait until the next day when he might be feeling better. But Maria just smiled and brushed off his concerns. She told him that she would be perfectly fine, that she would walk quickly, and that he needed to focus entirely on resting and getting over his fever. She leaned over, gave him a gentle kiss on his forehead, and then stood up. She picked up her handbag from the dresser, waved goodbye, and walked out of the room. Tito watched the door close, feeling a deep, lingering sense of unease, but his exhaustion soon took over, and he drifted off into a restless sleep. A few hours later, Tito was startled awake. He was still half asleep, his mind groggy from the fever, when he heard a sudden, violent noise. Someone was pounding on his front door. It was not a normal knock, it was a rapid, frantic, booming sound that echoed through the quiet mansion. The pounding did not stop. It was constant and panicked. Tito's first thought was that Maria must have returned home and forgotten her keys. But then he realized that she always kept her keys in her handbag, and even if she had forgotten them, she would not be knocking with this level of sheer desperation. Something was wrong. Teddo threw off his blanket, ignored the dizziness from his fever, and rushed down the grand staircase. He ran to the front door and flung it open. When he looked out into the cool night air, he did not see Maria. Instead, he saw a small group of his neighbors standing on his porch. They looked pale, and one of the women had tears streaming down her face. She looked at Teddo with an expression of pure horror and told him that he needed to come with them immediately. Minutes later, Teddo was running down the street, still wearing his nightclothes, trying to keep up with his neighbors. They led him to the entrance of a narrow, unlit alleyway that sat just on the border of their safe neighborhood and the sketchier part of town. As they drew closer, Teddo saw a large crowd of people gathered around the entrance, and the alleyway itself was filled with local police officers holding bright lanterns. Tito's heart was hammering against his ribs. He pushed through the crowd of onlookers, ignoring the police officers who tried to hold him back. He stepped into the alleyway, and that was when he got his first unobstructed view of the scene. In the middle of the dark cobblestone alleyway, there was a figure lying on the ground. The police officers moved their lanterns, and the light illuminated the face of the victim. It was Maria. She was lying face down on the cold pavement, surrounded by a large pool of dark blood. She had been stabbed brutally in the back. Tito felt the world spin around him. The shock was so intense and his fever was still so high that his brain simply refused to process what his eyes were seeing. It felt like a nightmare, a cruel trick, something that could not possibly be real. A police officer walked over to him, realizing he was the husband, and asked if he was indeed the husband of the victim. Tito could not speak. He just slowly nodded his head, his eyes locked onto his wife's lifeless body. The officer began asking him questions, wanting to know where he had been that night and if he had any idea who could have done this. But the words just bounced off Tito. He could hear the officer's voice, but he could not understand the meaning. He just stood there, shivering, staring at Maria. Later that night, the police escorted Tito back to his empty mansion. He sat down on the velvet couch in his living room, completely alone, staring blankly at the wall. He was shivering violently, partly from the high fever that was still ravaging his body, and partly from the massive adrenaline crash after seeing his murdered wife. He felt completely frozen. He could barely even remember how he had walked back to his house. Eventually, his body and mind could not take the strain anymore, and he collapsed sideways on the couch, passing out into a deep, feverish sleep, but sleep brought no relief. Almost immediately, Tito began having a horrifying, vivid nightmare. In the dream, he was standing in his living room looking out the front window of his mansion. He looked down the street and he saw Maria. She was stumbling toward the house, her clothes torn and covered in blood. There was a thick trail of blood trailing behind her on the cobblestones. She was crying out in pain, screaming Tito's name, begging him to open the door and save her. Tito woke up with a gasp. He sat bolt upright on the couch, drenched in cold sweat, his chest heaving as his heart raced. He looked around the room, realizing it was just a dream, but the terror was still incredibly fresh. He took a few deep breaths to calm himself down. But then, as he sat there in the silent, dark living room, he heard something that made his blood run cold. From somewhere outside, in the quiet distance, he heard the faint, clear sound of a woman's voice. It was Maria. She was calling his name. Over the next several days, Tito's physical fever eventually broke and his body began to recover. But his mind did not. The terrifying nightmares did not stop, and every single time he woke up from one, he would hear that same voice. He would sit up in bed, completely awake, and he would hear Maria's voice calling out to him from somewhere just out of reach. Sometimes it sounded like she was calling from the courtyard, sometimes from the street outside, and sometimes it sounded like she was whispering right next to his ear inside the house. He could never pin down where the sound was coming from, but he was absolutely certain it was real. It did not feel like a hallucination. It felt like she was actually there, calling out for him. While dealing with these terrifying experiences, Tito was also trying to get answers from the police. He went to the local station almost daily, begging the investigators for updates, but the police had nothing. They had not found the murder weapon, they had no suspects, and they had no leads. The investigators did tell Tito one detail. When they found Maria's body, she had no personal belongings on her. Tito told them that she had left the house carrying her expensive leather handbag, which contained her keys and some money. Because the handbag was missing, the police told Tito that the most likely scenario was that Maria had been the victim of a random tragic robbery. A thief had cornered her in the dark alleyway, demanded her purse, and when she resisted, or perhaps simply out of cold-blooded cruelty, the thief had stabbed her in the back and fled with her belongings. Tito knew that this was a highly logical explanation. It was exactly what he had feared would happen if she walked through those streets alone. But he could not accept that this was where the story ended. He wanted the police to find the person who did this. He wanted them to search every corner of Guanajuato, to find her handbag, to find the knife, and to bring the killer to justice. But weeks quickly turned into months, and the investigation went completely cold. The police had other cases to deal with, and Maria's murder was slowly pushed to the side. Tato was left in a state of absolute despair. He felt three overwhelming emotions that began to eat away at his sanity: profound grief over the loss of his wife, intense anger at the police for their perceived laziness and lack of progress, and a crushing weight of guilt. Tito blamed himself entirely for Maria's death. He believed that if he had not been sick, or if he had simply ignored his fever and walked her to her family's house anyway, she would still be alive. He also felt guilty for buying the mansion in that location. If they had lived somewhere else, she would never have had to walk through those dangerous streets. He felt like he had personally set the stage for her murder. This guilt and grief completely broke him. Tato stopped going to work as a mining engineer. He stopped taking care of his house, and he stopped seeing his friends. Instead, he spent almost all of his time sitting on the couch in his living room, staring out the front window. He was waiting. In some sick, desperate part of his mind, he believed that if he watched the street long enough, he would see Maria walking toward the house, just like she did in his dreams, and the voice did not go away. He continued to hear Maria calling his name at all hours of the day and night. It was constant, echoing through the empty halls of the massive mansion. Eventually, Tato's mind began to twist these experiences into a dangerous new belief. He decided that he was not going crazy and he was not suffering from grief. Instead, he convinced himself that Maria's spirit was literally trapped in purgatory, unable to rest, and that she was actively reaching out to him from beyond the grave. She was calling to him because she needed him to solve her murder. She was demanding justice, and until her killer was punished, her soul would be tortured forever. Once Tato accepted this belief, he realized he had to take action. If the police would not find the killer, he would have to do it himself. He began his own private investigation. He started walking the streets of Guanajuato, retracing Maria's final steps, interviewing neighbors, and asking local merchants if they had seen anyone selling an expensive leather handbag. He searched the rougher neighborhoods, looking for any sign of the knife or his wife's belongings, but he found absolutely nothing. He was met with blank stares, shrugs, and dead ends. While Tato was searching for answers, the city of Guanajuato began to experience a wave of bizarre and terrifying events. It started when a young drifter, a man who had recently arrived in town looking for work in the silver mines, suddenly vanished. Because he was a traveler with no family in the area, the police did not dedicate many resources to finding him, and his disappearance went largely unnoticed by the general public. But then, about a week later, a local woman who lived on the outskirts of the city disappeared without a trace. She had simply gone to the market and never returned. Just days after that, a well-known local male laborer went missing as well. The town was suddenly gripped by terror. 3 people had vanished in a matter of weeks, and none of them had been found. The local rumors began to fly. People whispered that there was a crazed serial killer roaming the streets of Guanajuato, snatching people in the dead of night, and disposing of their bodies where they would never be found. Many people in town began to connect these disappearances to Maria's murder, suggesting that she had been the first victim of this mysterious, bloodthirsty monster. Tito heard these rumors, and they only fueled his obsession. He felt like he was running out of time. His wife's spirit was still calling out to him, her voice sounding more desperate and agonizing with each passing day. He felt like he was failing her. And then, Tato had a conversation with a local woman who was known to practice dark magic and spiritualism. She was a witch living in a small, cramped home on the edge of the city, surrounded by jars of strange herbs and old books. Tato went to her in total desperation, explaining that his wife's spirit was haunting him, calling his name, and that he needed to speak with her directly to find out who had killed her. The witch looked at Tato and told him that there was indeed a way to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. She said there was an ancient, powerful ritual that would allow him to summon Maria's spirit so she could speak to him face to face and name her killer. But, she warned him, the ritual was incredibly dark and it required a massive amount of life force to open the gateway to the spirit world. It required a human sacrifice. To a rational person, this would have been the moment they walked away. But Tato was no longer rational. He was completely consumed by grief, guilt, and a desperate need to free his wife's soul. He took the witch's instructions, which detailed exactly how to perform the ritual, what symbols to draw, and how the sacrifice had to be made. The next day, Tato went out into the city. He targeted the young drifter who had recently arrived in town. Tato lured the man back to his mansion under the pretense of offering him a high-paying job at the mines. Once inside, Tato led the man down to the large, cold stone basement of his mansion. There, Tato struck him from behind, tied him to a chair, and brutally sacrificed him according to the witch's instructions. Tato set up a dark altar in the basement. He lit tall black candles, drew a large pentagram on the stone wall in the victim's blood, and recited the incantations. He stood in the dim, flickering light, waiting for Maria's spirit to appear and speak to him. But nothing happened. The basement remained cold and silent, save for the dripping of blood. Tito was furious and confused. He believed he must have done something wrong, or perhaps the sacrifice was not powerful enough. He went back to the witch, and she told him that the spirit of a traveler, someone with no roots in the city, did not possess enough spiritual connection to the local land. He needed a local soul, so Tito went out again. He targeted the local woman who lived on the outskirts of town. He abducted her, brought her to his basement, and sacrificed her on his altar. Again, he performed the ritual. Again, nothing happened. Maria did not appear. Desperate and losing his grip on reality entirely, Tito went out a third time and kidnapped the local laborer. He brought him to the basement and killed him as well, adding his body to the pile of victims in the corner of the room. He performed the ritual for a third time, but once again, the basement remained silent. Tito was living in a nightmare of his own creation. He had now murdered 3 innocent people, his basement was a literal house of horrors filled with decaying bodies, and he was no closer to speaking with his wife. He went back to the witch, screaming at her, demanding to know why the rituals were not working. The witch looked at him with a cold, knowing expression. She told him that there was only one sacrifice left that would ever be powerful enough to tear down the wall between the living and the dead. She told him that if he truly wanted to join his wife and hear her voice, he had to offer himself as the final sacrifice. Tito walked back to his mansion. He was completely numb. He realized that his life was over, but he was so consumed by the desire to be with Maria that he did not care. He went down into the dark basement, stepping past the horrific scene of his previous crimes. He set up the altar one last time, lighting the black candles. He filled a chalice with blood from his victims, placed his spellbook on the altar, and picked up a loaded handgun. He stood in front of the altar, looked at the bloody pentagram on the wall, and pulled the trigger. A short time later, a neighbor heard the single gunshot echoing from inside the Mejia mansion. Knowing that Tito had been acting strangely and living in isolation, the neighbor became worried and called the police. When the officers arrived, they found the front door unlocked. They searched the silent, grand rooms of the first floor, finding nothing out of the place. But then they discovered the door leading to the basement. When the officers walked down the stairs, they were hit by a smell so putrid it made them gag. They held up their lanterns, and the light revealed a scene that looked like something out of a nightmare. In the corner of the room lay the decomposing bodies of the 3 missing townspeople. On the other side was the occult altar, the chalice of blood, and the pentagram on the wall. And in the middle of the room, lying dead on the floor from a self-inflicted gunshot wound, was Teodolo Felenio Mejia. The police were horrified to realize that the wealthy, respected mining engineer had been the serial killer terrorizing their town. Tito had destroyed his own life, murdered 3 innocent people, and committed suicide, all driven by the phantom voice of his wife. And the ultimate tragedy was that Maria's death had indeed been nothing more than a random, senseless robbery gone wrong, committed by a passing bandit who was never caught. Now we are going to transition to our second story, which takes us to the freezing, windswept plains of Lyman County, South Dakota in the year 1899. If Guanajuato was a place of crowded streets and dark alleyways, Lyman County was the exact opposite. It was a vast, empty, and incredibly harsh landscape of rolling hills and endless prairie. In the winter, the temperatures would plummet far below zero, and massive, blinding blizzards would sweep across the land, making it incredibly easy for a person to lose their way and freeze to death in a matter of hours. The people who lived here were tough, rugged ranchers and cowboys who worked long, brutal hours tending to massive herds of cattle. On the night of April 2nd, 1899, a young cowboy named Charles Casmer was riding his horse through one of the worst blizzards the county had seen in years. The wind was howling, driving the thick snow horizontally, making it almost impossible to see more than a few feet in front of his face. Charles was shivering violently, his hands numb around the reins of his horse. Riding just ahead of him was another cowboy named Frank Hipa. Charles and Frank both worked for the massive Circle Bar Ranch, one of the largest operations in the area. Earlier that day, they had been out with a large team of cowboys, trying to track down and round up a herd of cattle that had drifted during the early stages of the storm. But as the blizzard intensified, the visibility became so poor that Charles and Frank had somehow gotten separated from the rest of the group. Now they were completely on their own, lost in the middle of a deadly whiteout. Charles was terrified, but his fear was not just because of the freezing temperatures or the howling wind. What truly terrified Charles was the man riding right in front of him. 5 years earlier, in 1894, Frank Hipa had been arrested and charged with the brutal murder of his business partner. The 2 men had gotten into a violent argument over money, and the partner had ended up dead inside the small cabin they shared. When the police found the body, the partner had been stabbed directly in the back. Frank had gone to trial, but he had managed to get acquitted by claiming self-defense. The local community, however, did not believe him. Everyone whispered that it was physically impossible to stab someone in the back in self-defense. They believed Frank was a cold-blooded, calculated killer who had simply gotten away with murder due to a lack of evidence. Charles knew this story well, and ever since he started working at the ranch, he had gone out of his way to avoid Frank. He never spoke to him, and he made sure he was never left alone with him. But now, the blizzard had forced him into a worst-case scenario. He was completely isolated with a suspected murderer, and he had no choice but to follow him if he wanted to survive. Frank seemed to have a strange, instinctual sense of direction, even in the blinding snow. He kept his horse moving forward, and Charles kept his horse close behind, praying that they would find shelter soon. Charles's horse was growing exhausted, its breath coming in thick white plumes, its legs shaking as it struggled through the deep snowdrifts. Charles knew that if his horse collapsed, he would die out there in the cold. Just when Charles was about to lose hope, a dark, blocky shape appeared through the swirling snow up ahead. It was a small wooden shack, half buried in the drifts. It looked old and weathered, but to Charles, it was a miracle. They quickly rode up to the side of the building, tied their horses to a wooden post where they would have some protection from the wind, and rushed to the front door. Frank pushed the heavy door open, and they stepped inside, slamming the door shut against the howling wind. The sudden silence inside the cabin was deafening. It was freezing cold inside, but just being out of the wind was an incredible relief. Charles immediately went to the stone fireplace and began stoking a small fire using some dry kindling that had been left behind. As the flames began to grow, casting a warm, flickering glow over the small room, Charles looked around. He noticed that every surface in the cabin, the small wooden table, the two stools, the shelves on the wall, was covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. It looked like nobody had set foot inside this place for years. Charles looked over at Frank, who was standing near the door, shaking the snow off his heavy coat. Charles made a casual comment, saying how incredibly lucky they were to have stumbled upon this abandoned, rundown shack in the middle of nowhere. But Frank did not smile. He looked at Charles with a cold, unreadable expression and said that luck had nothing to do with it and that the place was not abandoned. Frank said that the reason he knew the cabin was here, and the reason he was able to guide them directly to it through the blizzard, was because he used to live there. When Frank said those words, Charles felt a sudden, icy wave of fear wash over him, far colder than the wind outside. His mind began to race. He knew that Frank had killed his business partner 5 years ago inside his own home. He looked around the dusty cabin, at the small table, the stone fireplace, and the wooden floorboards. With a sinking stomach, Charles realized that this was not just any abandoned shack. This was Frank's old cabin. This was the exact spot where Frank had stabbed his partner in the back 5 years ago. Charles looked over at Frank, who had now sat down on a wooden stool near the fire. Frank had opened a can of beans and was eating them quietly, occasionally taking a sip of whiskey from a metal flask. He looked completely unbothered, sitting in the very room where he had taken a man's life. To Charles, the air in the cabin suddenly felt incredibly heavy and suffocating. He felt like he was trapped in a tiny box with a monster. The fear became completely overwhelming. He felt like he could not spend another second inside that room with Frank, even if it meant stepping back out into the deadly blizzard. Without thinking it through, Charles stood up. He looked at Frank and stammered that he was going to step outside for a moment to check on the horses and get a breath of fresh air. Frank did not even look up from his beans, he just gave a slight nod. Charles turned, opened the heavy door, and walked out into the howling storm. The freezing wind hit Charles instantly, but he did not care. He felt an immense sense of relief just being away from Frank and out of that horrific cabin. He walked over to where the horses were tied, leaning against the wooden wall of the shack to shield himself from the wind. He patted his horse, trying to calm his racing thoughts and figure out what he was going to do. He knew he could not survive the night outside, but he could not bring himself to walk back through that door. As he stood there, the wind briefly died down, creating a sudden pocket of quiet. In that brief moment, Charles heard a strange sound coming from inside the cabin. It was a loud, scraping sound, followed by a sudden muffled thump and a sharp, choking gasp. Charles froze. He thought that maybe Frank was having some kind of trouble, or perhaps someone else was in the area. He crept slowly back toward the cabin. He looked at the small front window, which was frosted over with ice. He wiped a small patch of frost away with his glove and peered inside. Through the dirty, distorted glass, Charles saw a dark, tall shadow move rapidly across the far wall of the cabin, near the fireplace. It looked like a person, but the movement was incredibly fast and fluid. Then, the shadow vanished. Charles ran to the front door and pushed it open, expecting to see Frank fighting off an intruder. He stepped inside, his hand instinctively reaching for the pocket knife he kept in his belt, but the cabin was quiet. The fire was still crackling in the hearth, casting its warm glow over the room. There was no intruder. There was only Frank. Frank was lying face down on the wooden floorboards in the middle of the room, his head positioned near the stone fireplace. He was not moving, and sticking straight up out of the middle of his back was a large bone-handled hunting knife. Dark blood was rapidly pooling around his body. Soaking into the dusty wood, Charles stood frozen in absolute terror. He looked around the tiny, one-room cabin. There were no other doors, and the window was locked tightly from the inside. There was absolutely nowhere for an intruder to hide, and no way for anyone to have escaped past him out the front door. He was entirely alone in the cabin with Frank's fresh corpse. A feeling of pure primal panic seized Charles. He did not know what had happened, but he knew he had to get away from that place. He ran out of the cabin, untied his horse, jumped into the saddle, and rode blindly out into the raging blizzard, leaving Frank's body behind. The next afternoon, the storm had finally passed, leaving the landscape buried under a thick blanket of pristine white snow. A few miles away from the cabin, two local ranchers, Arthur and Thomas, were out on horseback, inspecting a fence line that had been damaged by the heavy winds. As they rode along, they spotted a lone cowboy off in the distance, riding slowly through the deep snow. The cowboy was slouching heavily in his saddle, leaning far to one side as if he were about to fall off his horse at any moment. The ranchers immediately rode over to investigate. When they reached him, they found Charles Casmer. He was in terrible condition. His lips were a deep, dark blue, his face was pale and frostbitten, and his eyes were wide and vacant, staring off into the distance as if he were in a state of profound shock. He did not seem to register that the ranchers were there. The ranchers quickly pulled Charles off his horse, wrapped him in a heavy wool blanket, and gave him some hot coffee from a thermos. Slowly, the color began to return to Charles's face, and the vacant look in his eyes began to fade. He looked at the ranchers, his teeth chattering, and told them that they needed to follow him. He said that something unspeakable had happened at the old Hipa cabin, and that there was a dead man inside. The ranchers looked at each other, their expressions turning serious and uneasy. They knew exactly which cabin Charles was talking about. 5 years earlier, Arthur and Thomas had been part of the local search party that had helped the sheriff clean up the aftermath of the first murder at that very same cabin. They had seen the body of Frank's partner lying face down in front of the fireplace with a knife in his back. The idea that another murder had occurred in that exact same spot was deeply unsettling. Charles climbed back onto his horse, and the ranchers followed him as he guided them back through the snow to the isolated wooden shack. When they arrived, Charles stayed outside, refusing to go back in. Arthur and Thomas drew their rifles, stepped up to the front door, and pushed it open. When they stepped inside, they were hit by an intense, sickening feeling of déjà vu. Lying face down on the dusty floorboards in front of the fireplace was the body of a man, covered in blood, and sticking straight up out of his back was a large hunting knife. They walked closer, and when they rolled the body over, they gasped. It was Frank Hipa. The ranchers walked back outside, their rifles pointed directly at Charles. They asked him who else had been at the cabin last night and if he had seen the killer. But Charles, who was shivering and offering no resistance, simply looked at them and said that it had just been him and Frank. He said there was nobody else. Arthur and Thomas did not know what to believe, but the physical evidence was clear. Frank Hipa was dead, and Charles Casmer was the only person who could have done it. They tied Charles's hands behind his back, put him on his horse, and rode back to town, where they handed him over to the county sheriff. 2 months later, in June of 1899, a grand jury was convened in Lyman County to hear the case against Charles Casmer. The local prosecutor was highly confident. To him, the case was open and shut. You had 2 men enter an isolated cabin during a blizzard, and only one came out alive. The victim had been stabbed in the back, and the survivor was found wandering the prairie shortly after. It was a classic case of murder, but when Charles took the stand to testify in his own defense, he did not claim self-defense, which is what everyone expected him to do. If he had said that Frank had attacked him and he had been forced to kill him, the jury might have believed him, given Frank's violent reputation. Instead, Charles told the absolute truth of what he had experienced. He explained how he had run outside to get away from the terrifying atmosphere of the cabin. He described hearing the strange scraping and thumping noises from inside, seeing the dark, unnatural shadow move across the wall through the frosted window, and finding Frank dead with a knife in his back in an empty, locked room. Charles looked the jurors in the eyes and told them that he did not kill Frank Hipa. He said that Frank had been killed by a ghost. The courtroom was silent. The journalists who had traveled to the county to cover the trial began writing furiously, preparing to publish stories about the crazy cowboy who claimed a spirit had committed murder. Everyone expected the grand jury to laugh at the story, quickly find Charles guilty, and sentence him to hang. But then, the physical evidence was presented to the court, and everything changed. The sheriff brought out the murder weapon that had been pulled from Frank Hipa's back. It was a very distinct, custom-made, bone-handled hunting knife with a small, unique chip in the metal of the blade. 5 years earlier, when Frank Hipa had killed his business partner, that exact same bone-handled knife had been the weapon used. The police had taken the knife into evidence, and the county prosecutor had locked it securely inside a heavy, combination-operated iron safe in his private office, intending to present it at Frank's trial. But on the night before that trial was set to begin, the prosecutor went to his safe to retrieve the knife. When he opened the heavy iron door, the safe was empty. The knife had vanished. There were no signs of forced entry. The lock had not been tampered with, and only 2 people in the entire county knew the combination to the safe. Both of them swore they had not touched it. The knife had simply disappeared into thin air, and the trial had proceeded without it, which was one of the main reasons Frank had been acquitted. For 5 years, nobody knew what had happened to that knife. But now, here it was. The exact same bone-handled hunting knife with the exact same chipped blade had been found plunged into Frank Hipa's back in the exact same cabin, in the exact same spot where his partner had died. The grand jury looked at this evidence, and they began to realize that Charles Casmer's story, as absurd as it sounded, was the only thing that made logical sense. Charles was a newcomer to Lyman County. He had not lived in South Dakota 5 years ago when the first murder occurred. He had no connection to Frank's former partner. He had never seen the bone-handled knife, and he certainly had no way of knowing it existed, let alone accessing a secure, locked safe in the prosecutor's office to steal it. It was physically impossible for Charles to have possessed that knife. The practical, hardened ranchers who made up the grand jury were forced to confront a terrifying conclusion. They realized that if Charles could not have had the knife, then he could not have killed Frank. The grand jury officially dismissed all charges against Charles Casmer. They let him go a free man, officially ruling that they could not prosecute him because the evidence suggested that the spirit of Frank's murdered partner had somehow retrieved the missing knife and returned to the cabin to exact his ultimate revenge. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, the mystery of the missing bone-handled knife remains unsolved to this day, leaving a haunting question over the quiet plains of South Dakota. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.